Hi everybody, I'm Peter Laws and welcome back to the Flicks the Church Forgot. This is the show that looks at the deeper and sometimes spiritual themes of horror. Now this is part 3 of a special video series looking at the work of the massively influential, it's a mouthful, writer HP Lovecraft. His weird and creepy stories have spawned countless films and games and books and works of art and sculptures and albums and apparel. We'll look at some of those in a moment. But before we do that, you can check out part 1 if you'd like to hear my overview of the man himself and also an explanation of why myself as a Christian can find so much to love about Lovecraft's largely pessimistic and atheistic worldview. I actually find I admire it. There's a lot of things it makes me think, so I think it's cool. But in part 2, I share some of my favorite Lovecraft stories and a little bit of my introduction to Lovecraft as a teenager, as well as reviewing a really excellent, superb recent collection of his work called The New Annotated HP Lovecraft by Leslie S. Klinger. So if you want to look at that stuff, check out episodes 1 and 2. But in the next 2 episodes, I want to look at particularly at a group in America who have taken the craft of loving Lovecraft to the outer rims of creativity. We're going to be reviewing the films, the albums, the audio dramas put out by the HP Lovecraft Historical Society. When I first heard of the HP Lovecraft Historical Society, and I'll just call it the Society from now on to save myself valuable breath, it's quite a mouthful, I assumed that this was just some stuffy but interesting scholarly group who studied all things Lovecraftian. But it only takes a moment on their website to find that it's actually a very busy production house committed to keeping not only Lovecraft alive in the 21st century, but to an extent keeping that time period that he was writing alive too. Now remember, Lovecraft was writing mainly in 1920s, 1930s time. And this time period feels really vibrant in his stories, from his antiquated language to his discussions of art and science and philosophy of the time. There's a certain romance and mystery about that time period that captures the imaginations of modern people. Lovecraft, I suppose, is powerful and unusual in a way, is that he seems very locked to a time period of history, and yet he's talking about concepts and pondering science and philosophy in a way that I think feels quite modern. Sometimes current generations are guilty of looking back in the past generations and thinking that they didn't really have much to say, or they were pretty unenlightened, or didn't have any relevant things to offer. I reckon Lovecraft's a great example of how ridiculous that notion is. Although his racism, we can keep that in the past. But he's sort of timeless in a sense. He brings this stuff from the past into our future. And this is what the Society does very well, that they produce a bunch of stuff that feels like it's from the past and yet it feels relevant now. A Guardian article once described Lovecraft as the writer out of time. And you get the sense from the Historical Society is that he's just that. He's like this creative mind that slips into the modern day perfectly, and yet he brings the furniture and the settings of the period that he was writing in and somehow makes them feel relevant as well. Now, the Historical Society was born out of a role-playing game called Cthulhu Lives, which started in Colorado in 1984. Now think of this year for a minute. 1984 was the same year when a bunch of techno thrillers were coming out at the box office, like The Terminator, The Last Starfighter, the underrated Michael Crichton movie Runaway. And in that climate of future thinking, we get some young people who want to sort of go back to the past to discover adventure there. And I sometimes wonder if that wasn't inspired by another big movie franchise that was a big impression on people and young audiences in the early 80s. In 1984, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom came out, and Raiders of the Lost Ark came out years before, 81. So these were films that took modern special effects adventure, but they used it to encounter dark, sometimes esoteric sort of themes back in the 1930s. And I remember watching these films as a sort of horror fan, as a young kid as well, and saying, oh, I love the adventure and stuff, but there's something about the spookiness of these films set in that era which is really fascinating. I'd love to see more of that sort of stuff. Enter H.P. Lovecraft. But anyway, Cthulhu Lives was inspired by the more standard role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, which was a sort of sit around a table and chuck dice around type deal. But Cthulhu Lives in 84, they basically decided to try and make it a more theatrical, immersive experience, and so people would be doing live role-playing, in the sense they'd be playing these games and acting out these stories in the woods or walking through the desert. Now, as an aside, I actually remember back at my school when I was a teenager that there was a business class. And in the business class, one of the kids there decided to put on some live role-playing, and he invited loads of people to take part to help him out, and I did. And I was, remember, I was dressed up as like Dracula, like a vampire, stomping around in the woods, attacking people, while the teachers were standing around making notes on a notepad and looking a bit worried for our psychological welfare. Live role-playing. Anyway, Sean Branney and Andrew Lehman were these high school students who wanted to put a sort of theatrical feeling into the role-playing game, and so they came out with this thing, Cthulhu Lives. In 1987, they decided to make the organization the HP Lovecraft Historical Society, which was sending out newsletters and limited edition books to different members who were into the role-playing side. But they started to branch out into media as well, and they made a short movie called The Testimony of Randolph Carter, based on a Lovecraft film. And that's great. You know, it's got that 1980s vibe. The VHS vibe, which looks great. I sort of find it endearing seeing home movies. I think because I made some home movies myself, and you can tell, I mean, if you watch some of my stuff, like the Pumpkin Man that I've got on my YouTube site, you'll see that some of them are not so good, but looking at their work, you can see even from the beginning they were pumping it full of creativity and clever ideas and a bit more effort than the stuff I did. So let's have a look and see what other stuff they've done over the years, and we're going to start this evening by looking at their musical productions.
Look to the sky way up on high, there in the night, stars are no right.
I think it's in their music stuff that you'll start to see the real sly humor that runs through their work. I mean, for example, look at this. They brought out this CD in 2003, which is a very scary Solstice, which is basically Lovecraftian themed Christmas carols. And they followed that up in 2006, I think it was, with an even scarier Solstice. Now, these are literally what you might think. These are Christmas carols, and yet they're pumped full of Lovecraftian lyrics. Just check out this one, which is based on one of my favorite stories, The Shadow over Innsmouth. This is called It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Fishmen.
It's beginning to look a lot like fishmen everywhere I go. From the minute I got to town and started to look around, I thought these ill-bred people's gill slits showed. I
also love the song, The Carol of the Old Ones, which is on this album, which is sort of superb and kind of scary. Needless to say, the Silent Night, Blasphemous Night song and Unholy Night means that I'm probably never going to play these at my local Christmas Carol service if I am ever leading one. But I guess some would say that these songs might exploit and demean the Christian idea of Christmas. But look, I think it's just fun. It's tongue-in-cheek. There's a spooky edge to Christmas anyway. The festive season's always had this sort of like weird, ghostly sort of feel to it. So it didn't bother me at all. I think it's quite fun. It's all deliberately cheesy, of course. But in a fun way. Check them out. They're a good laugh. Play them around the Christmas tree this year. The next album they put out was ridiculously mad, which is called A Shoggoth on the Roof, which is a complete stage musical recording of a Lovecraftian parody of The Fiddler on the Roof, with songs like Tentacles and If I Were a Deep One. It's crazy weird, and it's genuinely funny with catchy tunes. I'd love to have seen this performed live. I love all of this crazy off-kilter humor. They even put a mockumentary about exploring this supposed musical's supposed like troubled history. So yeah, check it out. A Shoggoth on the Roof. It's one of my stranger CDs in the collection. Next up is they've done a couple of albums that have been directly inspired by one of my favorite short stories by Lovecraft, The Shadow over Innsmouth again. And Live at the Gilman House from 2011 is a pretend live recording of Ogham Waite singing amphibian-themed jazz standards on CD and LP and direct download, which is how I got it. But it also comes, if you buy the stuff, and you should really, it comes with a matchbook and a matchbook from the fictional bar and like a serviette from the bar as if it was real. And you might think, some people might think this is weird and pointless, but you know, I think it's great. It's cool. I've played this album in the background at dinner parties now and again, and you can see people sort of listening to it. Oh, a little bit of jazz, yeah. And then they're like, why is that man sucking and sort of gurgling into the mic? And then I have to explain. They also brought out another album recently called The Curious Sea Shanties of Innsmouth, Massachusetts. And this is pretty inspired in the sense that it's a bunch of like horror-themed maritime music, but it's through the filter of academic folklore. It's presented as a piece of sort of musicology scholarship. And it even comes with this, an academic monograph, which is filled with cultural and historical background to these made-up songs. Now, all of this might just be weird for some people to think, but it's so based in history and so earnest, it's quite easy to suspend disbelief when you're reading this stuff. And sometimes you're like thinking, wow, it's almost like I'm living in a world where the Cthulhu mythos is actually true, and maybe it really did happen in history. You don't really fall for that massively, but you fall for it a little bit. You let yourself fall for it. And I think that's one of the cool things about what they do. And at the beginning, the whole idea of immersing yourself into Lovecraft's work. Now, if you don't like sea shanties, you're not going to like this album, because it definitely is type of stuff. But if you like that sort of thing, and you're looking for some horror-fueled sea shanties for your next yacht voyage, you have totally found your album. Finally, let's look at Dreams in the Witchhouse, which is a Lovecraftian rock opera from 2013. This is certainly the most ambitious of the albums that they've made, and it draws in some top musicians from around the world, like guitarists from Wasp and Kiss, and they really ramp up the production values with high-gloss musical videos as well. And the result is a surprisingly effective piece of Lovecraftian pseudo-metal. The music really is great in this, but be prepared that it's definitely a rock opera. And by that I mean there are singers really that sound like something out of like Tenacious D or something, like oh no, yeah, like that sort of stuff. Some people will find that quite corny, but I suppose it is corny in a way, but it's a rock opera, so it's natural to be that sort of over the top stuff. So it's fun, and there's some really cool tracks on there. Especially there's a one called Between Reality and Dreaming, the second off last track, which is like heartbreaking and yet scary and disturbing. It's cool. Well, listen, we've discussed the Society and their albums, but do tune into the next episode where I'm going to be reviewing more stuff from the HP Lovecraft Historical Society, namely the Dark Adventure Theatre series, which is the stuff I really love, and the 2 feature films that they put out as well. So join me then for part 4 of this HP Lovecraft special, but until then, don't forget to subscribe, visit my website, follow me on Twitter at Rev Peter Laws. If you want to, you can even donate at my website if you want, so I can get some better equipment than what I'm using now. And also, don't forget the flicks the church forgot.